Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the trade deadline. It has come and it has gone, and the Sharks, along with many other teams, performed some pretty big trades. And so looking at it first from the Sharks' perspective, they made a couple, but one certainly more important than the other, as they acquire Gustav Nyquist from the Detroit Red Wings in exchange for a 2019 second-round pick, as well as a 2020 third-round pick that has a condition on it that if the Sharks are either to re-sign Nyquist or they are to make the Stanley Cup Finals this year, that third-round pick would become a second-round pick. So not too hefty of a price. The Sharks did not have to give up Kevin Labanc, or really any player for that matter, and the problem of missing a couple first-round picks didn't really come back to bite the Sharks, because they did end up still with a pretty solid player in Gustav Nyquist. As you can see, 62 games played, 16 goals, 33 assists for 49 points. So he's on pace for a career year in terms of assists and in terms of points. And of course, he was playing on a pretty bad Detroit Red Wings team. While he was on the first line there, you do have to look at the fact that he was playing against the top competition being on the first line, while here in San Jose, he's going to have the opportunity playing on the second or maybe even the third line, at which point the competition will be a bit lower, as well as the fact that he'll still be playing with some pretty solid players compared to in Detroit when he was playing with Larkin and whoever on the first line. So what this sort of deadline move means is that the Sharks have potentially become the deepest team in the entire National Hockey League in terms of offense. They were already second place in the league in terms of goals for, and if you take a look at the team ahead of them, the Tampa Bay Lightning, they are a deep team, but they aren't really first in goals for because of how deep they are, but because of the fact that they managed to field three superstar players, Nikita Kucherov, Steven Stamkos, and Braden Point. After that, it's a pretty big fall off to the next player who has the most amount of points on that team. And the Sharks, they have, you could argue, superstar Brent Burns, and after that it isn't really much of a fall off when you get to Pavelski, Meyer, Couture, Kane, Hurdle, Carlson, now Nyquist, even Labanc has 41 points. Thornton, if he had played a full season, would have about 40-ish points. And so it's just a ton of depth at the moment for the San Jose Sharks. Nyquist just adds to that. Now the Sharks are not going to have to play Redill. They're not going to have to play Michael Haley. If Peter DeBoer decides to dress Michael Haley on any of these last bunch of games over someone like Goodrow and Carlson, when earlier on in the season he refused to bench either of those two players, even when they weren't playing well, I don't even know if I would be mad with the fact that he'd play Haley. I think I would just kind of laugh at the fact that he somehow shoehorns him into the lineup anyways. But what it also means here, picking up Nyquist and not making any other significant moves to the NHL roster, is that one of the rumored things the Sharks would do would be to pick up a depth forward, and that did not occur here. So it seems as though the Sharks have committed to having Barclay Goodrow be the fourth-line center moving forward, unless something crazy happens, as in Dylan Gambrell steals his spot as the fourth-line center, which seems extremely unlikely. And so Barclay Goodrow, who a lot of people thought maybe should just move to the wing so that they can make room for someone like a Brian Boyle to come in and play a fourth-line center, or like what Eric Fehr did last year for the San Jose Sharks. That's not going to be the case here, and it seems as though all the faith rests into Goodrow to center that line. Another thing, and maybe what was most important, is a lot of Sharks fans were wondering if the Sharks would make a move like this, would be they did not acquire any goaltending assistants. There were rumors that the Sharks would be in on Jimmy Howard. There were rumors that they would be in onto Ryan Miller, as much as the fact that the trade materialized and then immediately was shot down. But Doug Wilson decides not to bring in any goaltending help, I'm sure, to the dismay of some Sharks fans, and some Sharks fans are also going to be happy. But it seems as though they have 100% faith into Martin Jones, and he's a goaltender who we have seen when he's under the pressure, he is able to perform. And right now, the Sharks, with such offensive depth, and they've got some great defense, the major question mark for many people is what is going to go on in nets. If Martin Jones can play at 15, actually not even just 15-16 Martin Jones, but any year's playoff Martin Jones, the Sharks have as good a chance as any to make a run for the Stanley Cup. But if Jones plays like 18-19 regular season Martin Jones, they might have some trouble moving forward in the playoffs, especially with some of the additions some of the other teams in the Western Conference and in the league in general have made at the deadline as well. So moving on to the lineup, who I expect Nyquist to play with. The first line, I feel like it will remain Meier, Couture, and Pavelski. There could be some experimentation that goes on with Nyquist on the first line, but I feel as though that first line will at least immediately stay together and see how it progresses in these last 20 or so games of the season. Then I think where Nyquist takes his spot is on the second line with Kane and Hertl. The reason being is that I just feel as though Nyquist is, in all facets of his game, a better player than Jonas Donskoi. I haven't watched too much Detroit, so I don't know like a ton about Gustav Nyquist, but from what I've seen and from what I've heard and from what I've read, he seems to be a player who really loves to hold the puck. He's got some great puck handling skills. He's a good passer. He's got a pretty sneaky shot. He got decent speed. He's not afraid to get to the blue paint to get some rebounds. And so really in every way, I would say he improves on Jonas Donskoi. I mean, Donskoi's shot is probably worse. Donskoi's passing ability is probably worse. The only thing that Donskoi was really stood out for him was the occasional time where he was able to stick handle and handle the puck in like a crazy way, make some cool deke. Very good in the shootout, certainly. But I think Nyquist actually has some great puck handling abilities as well when he holds this puck. And so, if anything, it's a pretty close tie. And otherwise, Nyquist, with the fact that he's a pretty good setup guy, he can play with Evander Kane, who is certainly a shoot-first kind of player, and he can also play with Tomas Hertl, who does a good job at opening up room for his line mates. And Nyquist, when he's going to have room, is going to be a very successful player for the San Jose Sharks, in my opinion, hopefully at least, I should say. It's also possible Nyquist could get a chance on the third line, but at the moment, I feel like the third line could stay together, Thornton, Sorensen, and LeBanc, and then have a fourth line, just Goodrow, Karlsson, and Donskoi. But I feel as though the players who could really move around are Sorensen, LeBanc, and Donskoi. It's possible Sorensen goes to the fourth line, Donskoi moves to the third line, just because Sorensen is probably the most defensively responsible player of those three, Sorensen, Donskoi, and LeBanc, so it might be better for him to be on the fourth line. But Sorensen does have very good chemistry with Joe Thornton, so I don't know if they're going to want to do that. I could also see Donskoi being on the third line and having LeBanc on the fourth line, but I feel as though that's also not something that should happen immediately, because LeBanc has been a much better player over the last, let's say, 10 games than Donskoi has, even though Donskoi has been playing with better players in Hertl and Kane. And so I think Donskoi at this point deserves sort of to be demoted to the fourth line, and we'll see how he could perform in that position. Another trade that the Sharks did make is they acquired Jonathan Dahlen from the Vancouver Canucks in exchange for Linus Karlsson. Linus Karlsson was the Sharks' third-round pick from last season. Vancouver Canucks, Dahlen was the second-round pick in 2016. They acquired him from the Ottawa Senators in the Alex Burrows trade, and it's some pretty good news, I guess you could say. At the time when they traded Dahlen for Burrows, it seemed like it was a massive overpayment by the Ottawa Senators, because Dahlen seemed like a pretty good player in terms of a prospect. This year, he does have 29 points in 50 games in his rookie season in the AHL, so also pretty good there. We'll see how Dahlen performs in these last few games with the Barracuda. The Barracuda are already one of the better teams in the league. We'll see if he can have some good chemistry with the rest of the team, and he could potentially be a forward that as soon as next year could be up with the lineup, depending on how the Sharks really see him develop. In terms of re-signing, as I said, there is a condition on the third-round pick that the Sharks traded for Nyquist, is that it becomes a second-round pick if he does re-sign. If we're considering the fact, let's say the Sharks don't make the Stanley Cup Finals, which I don't want to even consider, but still, it's technically possible the Sharks can re-sign Nyquist, but it seems extremely unlikely, honestly, because the Sharks they're definitely going to re-sign Timo Meier. It seems like they should re-sign Joe Pavelski as well, and so it basically comes up to the fact, if they re-sign Erik Karlsson, they have zero chance at Nyquist. They don't have the money for it, unless, of course, they don't sign Pavelski, which I don't think is going to happen. The only way Nyquist can ever be re-signed in this position, I feel as though that would be if Erik Karlsson does not re-sign with the San Jose Sharks. But even then, I feel as though the Sharks would go after a different UFA, potentially, let's say, an Artemi Panarin in the offseason instead of keeping Nyquist, unless Nyquist shows up here in San Jose, sort of like what Evander Kane did when he was traded from Buffalo last season, and just lights it up completely. If he can somehow put up like 20 points in these last bunch of games and be a good playoff performer for the San Jose Sharks, at that point, and if the Sharks make it to the Stanley Cup Finals, so they're already giving up a second-round pick in the draft in 2020, that point I could potentially see Nyquist re-signing if Erik Karlsson doesn't. But otherwise, I would say put it maybe like a 10-15% chance that Nyquist ever re-signs with the San Jose Sharks at the end of this year, maybe even a bit less than that. Next, on to the rest of the trade deadline trades, or some of the other big trades at the deadline. At my trade deadline review, I had been outlining some of the players who the Sharks could pick up, and they ended up mostly getting traded to some other teams. So first, Zuccarello, who was my original want for the San Jose Sharks. I wanted the Sharks to trade for Zuccarello, but he ended up going to Dallas. Sadly, he got injured for Dallas in their first game, but it was for a second-round pick and a third-round pick. The second was conditional, that if the Dallas Stars won two rounds in this year's playoffs, it would become a first. And then the third was also a conditional pick. If the Stars were to re-sign Zuccarello, that would also become a first. So a higher price tag than the Sharks paid for Gustav Nyquist, which maybe is the reason why they decided not to go for Zuccarello, because they didn't really have those firsts to offer up on condition. The Blue Jackets acquired Dzingel, also a player who I outlined as a possible target for the San Jose Sharks. They also acquired a seventh with that, giving the Senators 2 second-round picks as well as Anthony Duclair, so also a slightly higher price tag than what Nyquist commanded, mostly because of the fact that Nyquist did have a no-trade clause, and he really wanted to come to San Jose apparently, which sort of limited the options Detroit had, which drove down the price for Nyquist. The Nashville Predators acquired Wayne Simmons, another player who I outlined on my board. He was traded for Ryan Hartman, as well as a conditional fourth-round pick that will become a third-round pick if the Predators are to win just a single round in this year's playoffs. The Boston Bruins acquired Marcus Johansson, another player who I outlined as a potential target for the Sharks. He was traded for from the Devils for a second-round pick and a fourth-round pick, so actually a cheaper version than Gustav Nyquist, but I also think Johansson's not as good of a player as Nyquist, so not a huge loss for the Sharks there. The Nashville Predators acquired Mikael Granlund from the Minnesota Wild for Kevin Fiala. Now, I don't think the Sharks were in on Granlund because Granlund isn't a rental this year. He has another year on his contract, so then he's signed for 1920 and then he expires. So I don't think the Sharks were in on Granlund, as I said, but still, it was a bit of a weird trade that I don't think the Minnesota Wild came close to even winning here in this 1-for-1, but I felt the need to mention it. The Blue Jackets acquired Matt Duchene, as well as Sharks player Julius Bergman, who was actually traded in the Erik Karlsson, I think the Mike Hoffman trade, actually. He is now went from Ottawa to Columbus and then was traded basically like an hour later from Columbus to the Rangers in an Adam McQuaid trade. But Duchene and Bergman acquired by the Blue Jackets for Vitaly Abramov, a prospect, Davidson, another prospect, as well as a first-round pick, and then a conditional first-round pick, which is basically if Duchene re-signs with the Blue Jackets, the Senators get that extra first-round pick. So another player, I didn't outline him on the board necessarily because I thought he was maybe a bit too rich for the Sharks, but it was technically a possibility. The Winnipeg Jets acquired Kevin Hayes from the Rangers in exchange for Brandon Lemieux, a first-round pick, as well as a fourth-round pick that only actually occurs if the Winnipeg Jets are to win the Stanley Cup this season. Otherwise, there is no pick at all there, so it would just be Lemieux and a first. Hayes was also a player who I outlined for the San Jose Sharks. He wasn't a winger, but he was a centerman, and I said like Hurdle could move back to the wing or anything like that, so I didn't think it was likely the Sharks were in on Hayes, but it was possible. As well as maybe the biggest trade here, at least for San Jose Sharks fans, the Vegas Golden Knights acquire Mark Stone as well as Lindbergh in exchange for Brandstrom, one of the Golden Knights' top prospects. You could definitely say top 2 with Cody Glass, as well as Oscar Lindbergh. It's a different Lindbergh. The Vegas one, the one that they acquire, isn't really useful. The Senators' Lindbergh that they acquire is at least an NHL player, as well as a second-round pick. And so if you thought that the first place in the Pacific Division was important before to avoid the Golden Knights in the first round and play against an easier wildcard team like the Dallas Stars, like the Minnesota Wild, like the Avalanche, like the Vancouver Canucks, like the Coyotes or whoever, it's even more important now that the Vegas Golden Knights acquired most likely the best player who was on the market at this trade deadline, Mark Stone. It's probably a toss-up between who was better, Stone and Panarin, but Panarin sort of came off the market mostly once the Blue Jackets went all in with Duchene and Dzingel, so Stone was the hot commodity, and the Sharks get unlucky enough that he ends up in the same division and in a possible first-round opponent that the Sharks will have to face. The two other players who I did outline on my board as potential targets for the Sharks, Michael Furland, he remained with the Carolina Hurricanes, mostly because the Hurricanes, at the time that I made the video, the Hurricanes didn't seem like they were going to make the playoffs, but they've gone on some sort of insane stretch of hockey, so they've decided to retain Furland to try and make a push for the Stanley Cup this season, as well as Jacob Silfverberg, who actually re-signed with the Anaheim Ducks, so I guess he really likes it there. He was a potential option for the Sharks, not as likely as the others, because I don't think Silfverberg is as skilled as the others, but he ended up re-signing with the Anaheim Ducks anyway. But that will do it. The Sharks actually pull off a decently successful trade deadline. While Nyquist wasn't my first choice, he was definitely a player who I was targeting for the San Jose Sharks. I do like that the Sharks did acquire a scoring winger instead of trying to go for, let's say, some goaltending help or some depth help, because this is obviously the biggest impact possible move, in my opinion. And so it seems as though the Sharks are also one of these teams that are all in for the Stanley Cup this season. And if they were a favorite before, or if they were maybe just a contender before, they seem to probably be a favorite in the Western Conference. The Nashville Predators got better, though. The Winnipeg Jets got better. Probably the only team that didn't really get significantly better is the Calgary Flames. We'll see if maybe that will allow the Sharks to pass them for first place in the Pacific Division or not. But it's going to be a crazy last 20 games of the season, and an even crazier playoffs as so many teams have loaded up. Class dismissed.